A half-dead cat crawled like an old thought across the gravel, each breath a small miracle and each step a small betrayal of pain. The porch light above the back stoop shivered as if it too could not decide whether to keep burning. She reached for that thin ring of warmth, not with a plan but with a stubbornness older than hunger. The house behind the light slept, its curtains stitched with the kind of silence that holds secrets. Within it lived a man who had not yet learned to expect trouble and a grief that wore his coat like a second skin. In the camera's blind, poor, watchful glass mounted like a second eye, motion became confession. A tremor, a rag of movement, a single pupil like a chipped coin reflecting the bulb. The cat's legs remembered a language of alleys and roofs. Its chest remembered being full. Tonight remembered nothing. Something else watched besides the lamp, the patient gravity of a thing that would not give up. The porch light did not so much illuminate as promise, a thin mercy, a dare to the dark. In that thread of light the ordinary world held its breath, waiting for pity or miracle. Thomas Alder kept his life like a ledger, neat hours, neat bowls, neat silences. He had learned the arithmetic of loneliness the way some men learn to mend fences, by measure and repetition. Morning came and he mastered it with a cup of tea that cooled into memory. Noon unrolled itself across a thin book whose sentences did not demand much review. Night folded over him like an old coat he could not lift from his shoulders. The house sat on its bones and answered to the absence inside it with echoes that knew the cadence of another voice. In that house he practiced small certainties. The kettle warmed, the keys always returned to the same bowl, the curtains drawn at the same hour. He kept his life lined up as if order might be a remedy. He kept the porch light lit because she had liked the small stubbornness of it. The bulb hung from its brass arm like a candle in a vigil. Neighbors, when they spoke of him kindly, called it the little moon. The light did not banish the night so much as hold a place for it, a thin halo that meant someone remembered the margin between dark and home. On the swing the rope still bore the memory of fingers threaded together. On the banister the jasmine had rubbed a groove into the wood where someone had often leaned. Thomas did not speak of these signs to anyone. He tended them as one tends a ledger, with a quiet, almost religious precision. There was a small camera over the door, a practical contrivance his sister had urged after a rash of petty thefts down the lane. It watched with cool impartiality, its glass as indifferent as any unblinking eye that belongs to the street. Thomas checked the feed with the same slow curiosity he used to check his mail, habit topped with a hint of caution. Most nights the camera gave him nothing but rain on pavement and the soft choreography of wind through branches. It never, as he had thought, arranged meaning. It recorded and he interpreted. Beyond the stoop the garden kept its stubbornness of being. A jasmine vine twined thinly around the railing, its stems knotted with memory. Potted geraniums bowed from their rims like genteel heads. A lavender bush clung to the corner as if refusing abandonment. These plants were the last errands of two people who had once tended them together. Now they were tended by a single hand that moved with economy. In the kitchen drawer he kept small tokens, a ribbon of blue folded like a secret, a brass key to an empty shed, a pressed postcard from a trip they had never taken. He kept them not as trophies but as weather, things a man consults when the sky looks unfamiliar. His days moved on tracks grief had laid. He was a man who measured his meals the same way he measured his sentences, short, precise, avoiding flourish. The house answered him with its echoes and the scent of old laundry. Sometimes at dusk he walked the length of the porch and let his palm rest where the jasmine had rubbed the wood. These were acts without witnesses, and yet they were prayers of a sort, small attentions to a world that still required tending. One October evening, the weather turned the sky low and pale, as if some long hand had smudged the horizon. The radio murmured of rain. The trees agreed. Thomas, more from habit than hope, set his laptop with the camera feed upon the counter and watched the yard unravel in grain and gray. Gravel, the curb, the lamp trembling as if deciding whether to keep its warmth. For a while nothing moved. Then from the darker seam where fence met street, motion re-entered his life. The animal advanced like a thought that returns unbidden, slow, persistent, measuring its way step by small step. It did not hurry. Its progress was the work of someone conserving strength. On the screen, the movement was a study of will, a careful paw finding purchase, a head tilting at the smallest sound. The camera turned frames of ordinary night into a private theater, and Thomas sat straighter, as if attention alone might change outcome. At the threshold, the creature performed a small ritual. It paused, produced from somewhere a something, and placed it down with the tender deliberation of one who has learned to give what he can. Then it curled beneath the light and breathed shallow, as if that small act had completed a long accounting. The feed blurred the detail, but there was a line of color and the tilt of gentle jaws that made the scene no less true. Thomas felt an odd thing, call it curiosity or the beginning of belief, rise inside him. He rewound the moment twice because the human eye asks insistently for proof, and the heart prefers to be sure before it commits itself. There, in the lamp's thin pool, lay a strip of blue. It was a strip no more remarkable than any scrap, and yet its frayed edge and the faint soap-sweet scent that clung to its weave turned it into testimony. Thomas kept a ribbon very like that ribbon in a drawer he had not opened for months. He had saved it because she had used it, because some objects in a shared life are kept as quiet gestures to themselves. He opened the drawer then not because he doubted, but because habit needed verification, and there the blue lay, folded, smelling like summers and laundry in the poor steady courage of everyday things. He went to the door, and found the night warmed by the porch light, and the air carrying the city's particular smell of smoke and wet leaves. The animal lay coiled beneath the lamp, and when it lifted its head it regarded him with a look that was not supplication, but an expectation of recognition. It made no sound. In its patience he read a sort of composure that comes to those who have long been given a second chance. Thomas stooped and picked up the ribbon. For all its thinness it carried weight. When he pressed it to his nose, the scent of a life he shared rose, faint and insistent. The motion in him that had been practiced into stiffness softened, and something he had hidden behind daily certainties shifted. The animal, as if performing an unseen choreography, rose and crossed to the lavender pot, tapped the clay with its paw, and half a handful of soil fell. In that disturbed place, a pale green shoot pushed thin and stubborn through the surface, an answer from a plant that had not been coaxed in months. After that night he began to watch the feed not as a man watches weather, but as one watches a slow, emerging argument. The animal returned on evenings with rain and with dry wind, each time leaving small things at the porch. A coin worn smooth, a scrap of cloth washed by too many rains, a key dulled by age. The cat's gifts felt at once accidental and deliberate, as if someone or something were rescuing the fragments of a life and placing them gently at his threshold. Thomas measured each gift with the care he had once reserved for apologies and ledgers. He began to imagine patterns where before there had only been the raw material of nights. Neighbors spoke of wandering cats and of animals that came and went. That is what they always did. Yet Thomas observed with the patience of a man who had once made a living from careful observation. The cat traced the same route each time, paused beneath the lamp, tapped the same pot. The blue ribbon shifted in his drawer from private memory to a thread binding him to movement outside his home. He found himself less insular. He began to notice the way the jasmine twined more closely after the nights the cat disturbed the lavender, how soil in the saucer marked the return of a small disturbance. Attention, he saw, begets life. One rain-silver night the creature came bearing something heavier. It moved with the same economy of motion, and left in the lamp's pool an object stamped with a mark Thomas knew as well as a thumbprint, an engraving he had seen against a throat long ago, on a chain she had kept close. The camera recorded it as a smear of metal, a dark thing in yellowed light, and his heart misfiled the moment as both proof and provocation. The pattern was now a question. Who gathered the past and returned it? Was it accident or design, or something else that moved through the gutters and held a memory like a tight fist? The ledger of his days tilted. He closed the laptop with hands that trembled less from fear than from the strange buoyancy of being made visible to something other than his own reflection. He left the porch light burning that night, not from stubbornness but from a new small hope that the light might serve as a signboard for whatever was at work. The cat slept beneath the lamp and the lavender exhaled the faint, bitter perfume of soil. The ribbon and the coin and the pin, these small deliverances, had come like letters from a past he thought sealed. The house kept its silence, but within that silence another thread had been laid across the floor. Thomas understood that an account had been opened he had not asked for and did not know how to close. The object at his threshold was not merely a token. It was an invitation. He had choices, each with its own arithmetic, to ignore, to catalog, to ask the neighbors impertinent questions, to leave the items where they were, and pretend that having received them changed nothing. He placed the recovered things together in the drawer as if grouping ink-stained receipts. He sat down at the kitchen table, hands folded, and felt for the first time in many evenings the small, weird buoyancy of a life that might yet be surprised. He left the porch light burning not only as a vigil but as an act of welcome. If this gentle story touched your heart, subscribing keeps this quiet little corner alive. The lamp on the porch kept its small vigil while the street around it whispered and folded into itself. It was, by then, a thing Thomas counted on in the way a man counts on the steady pulse of a city. After the first nights of gifts and small mysteries, the camera became his confidant. Its grainy eye returning the same slow choreography, the cat arriving from the same dim seam, the ritual pause beneath the light, the deposit of a thing that might once have been lost, and then the curling into sleep that looked more like waiting than rest. Thomas learned the animal's timing the way he had once learned the cadence of someone else's step, patiently, reverently, with a hunger to find pattern where there had been only silence. Neighbors offered explanations at a safe distance. Mrs. Patel from next door suggested, with the smile she used for small cruelties, that old men and stray cats make for rich gossip. The boys at the shop traded tall tales of alley witches who tied memories to collars. Thomas heard them as one hears the murmur of rain. Unless you stand under it, the sound remains rumor. He was not a man inclined to story. Yet each night the camera presented a narrative he could not comfortably ignore. The cat's gifts were never random. They fit his life too closely to be mere happenstance. With the blue ribbon folded in its drawer like a small accusation, Thomas found his hands doing odd work, unnecessary polishings, straightening of picture frames, the kind of movement grief teaches you to avoid. The things the cat left did not simply arrive. They seemed to place themselves in the story as if correcting some ledger he thought closed. A coin stamped with a year that sat on the mantel the day they met. A scrap of paper that had once been a ticket stub from a film they had slept through. A dried petal pressed into a book that smelled faintly of lavender, as if the plant itself had been lettered into the exchange. Each item brought memory not as a mercy but as a summons. There were nights the cat did not come. Those nights felt like miscounted steps. The porch light burned in polite perplexity, and the camera watched the same empty expanse. Thomas's pulse thrummed in the quiet like a moth caught in glass. In the spaces where the cat had been, he began to hear echoes, the small fanfare of a life once shared. He would sit and listen until the quiet rearranged itself into the shape of absent conversation. On such nights, he would take out the blue ribbon, hold it to the light, and wonder whether the thing outside was making amends or rehearsing a lesson. Perhaps, he thought, the cat was only a cartographer of loss, tracing routes back through things left behind. Then the rhythm shifted. It did not happen in a moment of spectacle. It came in the little ways the world shows you a hinge has moved. The cat's visits became more frequent, sometimes twice a night. Its pauses under the lamp longer, as if refusing to break a prayer. The objects it left grew in significance. A small bronze key with a notch that matched one Thomas had once used for a garden shed he had barely opened since the funeral. A tag of leather stamped with a name he had not heard spoken since marriage became memory. The gifts started to arrange themselves around the blue ribbon like a constellation. And Thomas, who had measured most things in his life with a ledger and a sensible pen, began to track them with a superstition that felt like tenderness. The neighborhood, which so often offered only the mechanical kindness of neighbors who keep the hedges trimmed, began to tell him stories. Marcus, a boy who worked afternoons at the corner grocer, mentioned seeing the cat slip under the fence toward the old railway embankment. "It goes there when the moon is thin," Marcus said, as if reporting the weather. Marcus's voice carried that particular certainty of youth, that the world still held corners where consequences were simple. Thomas listened, and a map redrew itself in his head. Porch, lamp, fence, embankment, the dark river of an alley that carried the city's discarded things. The map invited movement. There was a tension that grew not from sound but from the texture of attention. Where before Thomas had watched the camera as one might watch weather, he now planned for its feed like a man planning to follow a letter to the place it promised. He bought a small flashlight whose beam shook less than his hands when he tested it. He repaired a pair of boots that had outlived their owner's attention. He began to leave the porch light burning earlier and later than before, as if offering a wider invitation. Each preparation felt like a prayer translated into habit. The cat's behavior itself leaned toward a lesson. It began to leap the low fence that marked the alley with more ease, to linger in the growth of nettles that pressed against the brick wall. Sometimes it would sit with its back to him, a silhouette under the lamp, and appear to regard the road as though it were cataloging comings and goings. On several mornings he found the lavender saucer disturbed more widely than before. The soil upturned in a pattern that suggested not aimless digging but a search. The plants, once merely tokens of the life he had kept, now seemed to act as props in a play they had not consented to be in. Complications arrived like rain. Someone else noticed the pattern. Mrs. Patel, with the stern mouth she used when people's lives concerned her knitting circle, spoke of odd men loitering near the embankment. "They're petty thieves," she declared with the moral authority of someone who knows injustice by its headline. Thomas nodded without meeting her eyes because the ledger inside him had not yet been moved to expose the bruise beneath. Yet an unease, more precise than loneliness, took root. If the cat's gifts were not merely retrievals but transfers, things rescued from less kind hands, then whatever force guided the cat was also, navigating among people who trafficked in loss. One night the camera caught motion that was not the animal. Thomas replayed the footage until the blur of it resolved into shapes. A man's silhouette, quick as a fox, moving near the fence. The cat appeared and, with the patience of a small priestess, trod between the man's legs as if insisting on recognition. The man recoiled with a sharpness that read like guilt. The camera, which had once been a window into the ordinary, now offered frames that tasted of accusation. Thomas's heart learned new rhythms, beats of suspicion and of dread. He could no longer tell whether the cat was a messenger, a thief, or a guardian warding things he could not name. The more he watched, the more Thomas's past and present braided. The recovered objects painted a portrait not only of a life lost, but of people who had passed through it and left pieces behind. A scrap of a map, pinned to a city district he had stopped visiting, a watch face that showed a time he had once promised to keep, a button engraved with initials that matched those on a letter tucked away in a shoebox. Each recovered piece refracted back a life in facets he had allowed to gather dust. He began to ask questions of himself he had not posed in years. Would he go looking if the clues pointed to the living? Could he cross into the places that once meant risk? The ledger in him added columns and sums he had not planned for. At the midpoint of the rising thread, the cat performed an act so small it might have been missed if the camera had not caught it with that unkindly intimacy of pixels. It left a scrap of paper folded into a thin square and beside it, a photograph. The photo was the sort that kills hesitation. A picture of two people sitting on a bench by a river, faces blurred slightly by time but posed with a familiarity that burned. One face, Thomas's, was younger and rounder. The other, a woman's, had the familiar tilt of a laugh. In the corner of the photograph, written in an ink that had bled slightly with old rain, was a name Thomas recognized with the kind of shock that rewrites day into memory. There was, in that instant, a gravitational pull. Thomas did not touch the photograph at once. He sat with it on the table and watched it as if he watched his own chest in the quiet, the thing rising and falling with the hard work of life. The photograph was not a thing he expected to see. It was rather a summons. He replayed the camera footage of that night over and over, until the cat's small paw that placed the photograph became a ritual. The question that rose through him like steam was not who had lost these things, but why they had been returned in this manner. The cat had become a courier of memory. Who then was the postman? It was around this time that Thomas spoke aloud to the house for the first time in months. He said nothing weighty. He offered the small human ceremonial words, "Who are you?" And in the asking he heard his own voice like a stranger's. No answer returned. The cat, when present, sometimes looked toward him with eyes that contained a patience older than weather, and older than grief, and Thomas found his old defenses lowering like a tide. He considered for a moment letting the matter be. To accept gifts without asking from whatever mechanism of kindness hauled them to his threshold. But some ledger lines once crossed, rearranged the accounts of a life. The cat's deliveries were not just about objects. They were scaffolding for a narrative he had been unwilling to inhabit. There were voices, actual human voices, beyond the camera's grain. Marcus, the grocer boy, offered to show Thomas the embankment. "You shouldn't go alone," he said, as if the world still made sense when shared. Mrs. Patel fussed a shawl into his hands the way some people offer armor, and her eyes, sharp, practical, bore the statement of someone who had seen too many small tragedies begin with single steps. The community had decided that curiosity needed stewardship, which is to say people like to share responsibility for the unknown. Thomas accepted their company with a guarded gratitude. He wanted, in the most private way, to walk the map the cat had traced, but feared what he might find at its end. They went one evening when the moon slit the sky, and the embankment smelled of oil and old rain. The path there is half choked with nettles and papers and the bones of things people cast aside. The cat awaited them like a small sentry in the shadow, its figure thrown long by a single street lamp across the iron. It did not flee at their approach. Instead, it walked slow as a sermon into the dark. Thomas followed, Marcus at his shoulder and Mrs. Patel muttering a list of sensible concerns as she followed in an indecisive shuffle. The embankment held the city's discarded history in piles and drifts. Here a broken bicycle, there a door panel leaning against a heap of cardboard like a piece of architecture that no longer wanted to belong. It was among these objects the cat paused and, with a patience that suggested ceremony rather than mere animal instinct, began to dig, not frenetically, but with a focused determination as if searching for a name in the dirt. Marcus knelt to watch. Mrs. Patel crossed her arms and made a face that meant she had always been skeptical of the world's romances. Thomas, with a heart that banged at his ribs as if it had been invited to a secret, crouched beside them. The cat's paws revealed a rusted tin box at first, the kind that remembers jam in summers. Its lid resisted with a creak that sounded like memory being forced open. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, and when Thomas's fingers brushed it, he felt that peculiar animal arousal of hope and dread the body mounts against shock. He pulled the cloth aside and found a locket, brass worn at the edges, the clasp loosened by time. When he opened it, the photograph within was small and precise, a face he knew not as memory but as presence. It was her, alive in the silver dark of the locket, smiling a way she only ever had when she expected trouble and intended to be unbothered by it. There are moments when a life rearranges in the span of a breath. Thomas dropped the locket as if it had burned him, and the sound of metal on metal echoed like a bell. Marcus made a small noise, half boy, half riverbird. Mrs. Patel swore softly and then, in a tone that moved toward indignation, asked why anyone would hide such a thing. For Thomas, the world condensed into a single line of question. Where had this been? And how had it been made to return by a creature that did not keep watches on human hearts? He took the locket home and placed it on the table beside the photograph the cat had left. The two images, one small and private, the other larger and splayed with the blunt honesty of a piece of paper, stared at each other across the wood as if in recognition. They bound him between them, the private, intimate talisman he had thought irretrievable, and the public gesture of return the cat effected with a care that seemed almost human. The ledger in him flipped pages. He could remain a man who kept numbers and habits, or he could read the handwriting the city had offered and allow its pen to write new things across his days. The turning point, when it arrived, was not dramatic in the way novels often insist upon drama. It arrived as an act of will. Thomas found himself waking before dawn and preparing a small kit, a torch, a light scarf against the damp, a notebook in which to write the clues as they presented themselves. He intended to follow the cat not as a man on a whim, but as an investigator of his own life, to see whether the returns at his porch might point him toward a living person who either wanted to be found or to be left alone. The choice to go, sudden to everyone but him, was the sort of breach from which there is no simple step back. He had, in effect, decided to trespass into whatever current had been set in motion. He began to walk the city at night like a man moving through his own veins, following the cat's faint map. Under the bridge where the river learns the language of alleys, past the bakery that kept its ovens warm long after closing, along the stretch of road where neon signs bled into their own reflections. The cat led without haste and seemed to know the exact moments to wait, to pace, to prod. Its behavior grew less like that of a feral animal and more like a creature with a mission. Sometimes it would mew with a sound like a small bell, insistent, human in its timing. Thomas learned those mews as a language, a summons, a command, a question. Midway through one of these nocturnal pilgrimages, while the world leaned toward a hush and the city's underbreath was the sound of distant traffic, Thomas paused and thought of the bonded oddity of it all. He reached into his pocket and, by habit more than design, fingered the blue ribbon folded there. It had traveled with him now, from drawer to night to pocket, as if the life he kept needed to be clasped near his skin. He looked up at the cat that waited in a pool of lamplight and asked the question that had settled like a stone in his throat. Have you ever had an animal wait for you when you didn't ask them to? Do you believe cats know when we're at our lowest? The questions hung more for the comfort they offered than for hopes of answer. And yet in that asking, Thomas felt part of an audience larger than his own small skin, people who keep watch of other people through nocturnal kindnesses. Marcus, when he spoke then, said something he had not intended to say aloud. It's like they're gathering souls, isn't it? He muttered, not being one for metaphors but reaching for one by mistake. The phrase, said with the uncertainty of youth, landed in the night and made Thomas consider the ways in which things gather. Not merely objects, but memories, apologies, debts. The cat, who might have been only a stray, appeared to be a ferryman who carried other people's remnants across thresholds that humans often leave locked. The cat's finds led them to places that made the hair on Thomas's arms rise: an old chest in a shuttered second-hand store, a basement under a church where they found a carved box with handwriting that matched a letter he had once folded and hidden. Each discovery gathered a whether and a why, and with each why the neighborhood's interest grew from polite curiosity to something more resembling communal investigation. People started to leave breadcrumbs, literally and in the metaphorical sense of gossip, along the embankment. Someone taped a paper to the lamppost with a crude drawing of a paw and the phrase, "Lost things returned, no questions asked." The sign read like a permission and a warning. As the trail tightened, so did the possibilities of danger. They were not theoretical. Someone was keeping watch. One night Thomas nearly missed them, a figure in the shadow that moved with the careful step of someone who belongs to both the familiar and the wicked. The camera had caught this before, the silhouette that recoiled at the cat's insistence, and now the live nights bore the taste of threat. Marcus, who had once been a boy who expected the city to be straightforward, stopped sleeping as well. He would not go with Thomas alone any longer. He insisted, stubborn as children are when they claim ownership of fears. Mrs. Patel clucked her tongue and took to walking circuits of her own, as if a watchful elder could stand between a man and the darker parts of the world. The cat, meanwhile, did not blink at danger. It stepped through it as if danger were only another texture to be negotiated. On an evening when rain hung from the sky like tears that could not quite fall, the animal darted toward a figure huddled beneath an overhang. The figure was not human, but a heap of clothing that at first suggested no life. Then a hand moved with the wet slowness of someone who has been left to themselves too long. The cat touched the hand and then, with an almost reverential economy, brought forth from its mouth another small token, a name tag that Thomas had once seen on a suitcase. This tiny, useless thing held the weight of accusation. Someone had been moving through their lives and leaving pieces behind as if trying to be forgiven by a circle of strangers. The nets that had formed around the embankment tightened. A man known only as Judge, who ran a pawn shop and kept the kind of moral ledger that never balanced, started asking questions that smelled less of concern and more of ownership. "If someone's returning what's been stolen, they'll be one of us," he declared loudly in the shop. And those words fell on ears that liked to believe the world functioned on trades and bargains. The atmosphere, which had been curious, shifted toward calculation. People who had once shrugged at stray cats now watched them with a calculation that meant trouble. If something could be regained, it could also be claimed. Thomas's inner conflict reached a kind of fever. He had crossed from careful observer to participant, and in so doing had traded the safety of apathy for the peril of engagement. He found himself lying awake at night, the phone light tracing the same map across his palms: porch, embankment, the shadowed places where people keep their shame. He wanted to be the moral center of this small drama, to stand against the idea that memory could be stolen without consequence. He had to decide whether to demand answers or to be content with the cat's quiet ministry of return. Each choice now bore cost. Then came the turning point of no return. The moment when intent met risk and the path behind him sealed itself in shadow. It was not a thunderclap or the arrival of a famous antagonist. It was, as many such moments are, a small, ordinary act with extraordinary consequences. Thomas had followed the cat farther than usual, past the stretch of boarded-up shops and through an underpass that smelled of iron and the sea. The animal moved with purpose, and when it paused beneath a low arch of brick, it mewed with a sharpness that cut through the damp air. Thomas, who had learned to translate the cat sounds by now, moved closer and peered into the gap. There, half buried under a faded tarpaulin, lay a crate. The cat pawed at the lid and then tapped at the fabric like someone insisting on attention. Thomas lifted the lid and found what he had not expected. Not a thing, but a stack of things wrapped in oilcloth and tied tight. Letters, a child's shoe. A watch stopped at a time that corresponded to a day Thomas had documented in his own ledger. The things suggested a life pulled into pieces and hidden away. He pulled one packet free and found at the center a photograph tucked into the fold. It was the same riverbench image, but this time the background offered a face he had not known to expect. He looked up in the hollow of the underpass and felt the breath leave his body as if a hand had placed its palm across his chest. There was a sound behind him. Not the city's ordinary noise, but the careful step of someone who knows when they are not alone. He turned and saw in the diaphanous light under the bridge a figure that wore the night like a coat. The face was half hidden and yet familiar in a way that defied ordinary sense. Someone he believed absent, a person he had placed beyond the ledger of his life. The world narrowed to a single sharp point. The camera at the house, if viewed from its feed, would later show a man standing at his own porch, the light cutting his shadow into the warm wood, and the cat returning home with the slowness of one who has completed a duty. But in that underpass, with the rain beginning to beat out a rhythm like a clock, the figure stepped forward and spoke a single word that Thomas had not expected to hear in the flesh. His name. The word hung, precise and dangerous, and in its pronouncement, the night split open into possibilities, none of them safe. The cat looked between the two of them, tail flicking in a small percussive gesture, and for a moment its eyes glinted with something he could not name: mischief, triumph, warning. Thomas's hands tightened on the packet of oilcloth. The choice he had made to follow had placed him where choices were now no longer wholly his own. Behind the figure, in the deeper shadow, something moved, too quick for the city to be mere background, too deliberate to be random. Thomas felt the years tighten like a rope around his throat, a memory, a debt, a promise that had not been kept. The figure's mouth moved again, forming words he could not quite catch. Someone else shifted behind them as if to offer confirmation or to close a circle. The air tasted metallic, like a coin turned by a glove. The cliff fell away. Thomas realized with a sudden clarity, bitter as winter, that the story had been circulating without his consent. The cat had been collecting shards of a truth that now threatened to be more than a recovery of objects. The crate, the locket, the photograph, they were not only remnants but coordinates on a map someone else was tracing. The person who stepped out of shadow had the kind of familiarity that reopens old wounds, and the rain, thin and unrelenting, kept the world from giving them the privacy of silence. The last image before the night closed was the figure's hand lifting, palm outward as if offering peace or demand, and Thomas's own hand still gripping the photograph. Between the two of them, the cat sat like an enforcer of a law older than argument, its gaze steady. The air held a single withheld thing, a name, a connection, an accusation, or a confession. Whatever it was, Thomas felt it poised on a hinge to change everything. And then, before anyone could speak the word that might set the next motion into being, a sound from the embankment, sharp, metallic, and very close, split the air. The underpass breathed with a hollow sound that was neither welcome nor wholly hostile. It was the sound of places that remember every footstep and keep them like small bills to be paid later. Thomas stood in that hollow, the packet of oilcloth a cold, wrinkled thing in his hand, the photograph damp at the corner from the rain that had the city by the throat. The figure before him, stepping from shadow as if the night itself had chosen to walk, did not carry the swagger of a stranger. When the face resolved, it was as if a page Thomas had long folded and tucked back into his ledger had been unfolded and read aloud. Familiarity and the ache of missing joined in one sharp syllable. "Evelyn," he said, and the name came out of him like a key slipped into a lock he had not intended to try. The word trembled, not because he doubted, but because saying it aloud asked the house of memory to answer. and houses seldom answer without cost. She looked older in the way absence ages people, lines folded as if from wind, but something in her gaze had not been altered by time. The small practical kindness, the way one corner of her mouth held amusement like a secret. Her coat was patched at the elbow, as if stitched by domestic hands that kept going whether they were noticed or not. Rain made a pattern on the tarpaulin they stood beside and made everything seem like watercolors bled into one another. For a moment they were two shapes under the bridge, and the city beyond them held its breath. Thomas felt all his rehearsed responses gather like a storm behind the throat, and then pour into a single, unpracticed question. "Why did you go?" The line of her jaw moved. She did not answer with explanations. She answered with the kind of truth that is simplest when it is most painful. "I left because I thought it would save you," she said. The syllables were precise, not theatrical. There was no appeal to drama in them. Only the blunt instrument of a decision explained. Around them the embankment kept its secrets. The cat sat by the crate as if presiding over an altar of small histories, its tail a metronome clicking the time of something older than both of them. Marcus shifted behind Thomas and made the small noises people make for company. Mrs. Patel, who had followed at a distance and who preferred to keep her compassion wrapped in the hard cloth of practicality, planted her hands on her hips and watched the slow reconciliation of two lives, like someone watching a pot come to boil. Evelyn spoke in a voice tempered by long roads. There were debts. There were men who thought they had ownership of the pieces of our life. I thought I could hide what mattered and keep them from taking you. She reached once into a pocket and pulled out a coin, the same color as the one the cat had left on the mantel. She turned it in her fingers as if setting it to rights. Thomas, who had kept his mourning neat and his anger down in black ink, felt the neat rows of ledger he had maintained begin to slant. "You hid," he said, standing in the only posture honesty sometimes offers, bewildered accusation. "You hid and let me grieve you." "That was easier," she replied. "For a man like you, Thomas, grief wears a uniform. People know what to do with a uniform. If I had stayed, they might have taken pieces of us anyway. I thought—" She broke off, not from rhetoric, but because the reason was too human and too small to wrap in words. "I kept things safe where I could." "And the things that came home?" Thomas asked. He looked at the cat, which watched without comment, and at the little constellation of recovered objects that had become the scaffolding of a strange conversation. "Did you teach it to return them?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed in a smile that was almost a confession. "No," she said. "I did not teach the cat. The city taught it as it taught us all. Where to find, how to carry, how to leave evidence that says, this once mattered. I trained other things, people to hide, places to bury. The cat just happened to be one of the trains the city runs on." Her hand hovered at the locket and then left it be. "But I knew someone would follow the trail I left if they were watching for it." "You knew I was watching," Thomas said. The accusation hung in the rain like a small flag. There was no watching, only answering. Evelyn's voice had the patience of someone who had learned to speak to men who kept scales and columns in their heads. "You would have been harmed by what I knew. You live by numbers, Thomas, and debts are numbers. I tried to turn a ledger into a map you could not read so you would have an easier life." The truth was a blade. It cut through the neat papyrus of his grief and left raw skin beneath. All the things returned to him were not the work of simple benevolent theft. They were part of a deliberate architecture that had been erected to protect, to confuse, to preserve. He had been a steward of a house that had been designed without his knowledge, to be a hideout for pieces of a life that had been exposed to danger. But who? Thomas started, the list of people he had suspected rising from his chest like a row of small, useful firebrands, Judge Harlan petty thieves, a neighborhood that had learned to profit from other people's mistakes. Who took them? Who kept them? Her face closed a fraction. Not theft in the way you imagine. Men with ledgers make arrangements. I was given until I could make other places for these things. I was given choices. Some were to pay, some were to keep safe. When I left, I hid what I could, and I buried others where the city would keep them safe enough. But they came back wrong. She allowed a thin, bitter laugh to pass. Things that were meant to keep us kept us. Things that were meant to secure life secured only debt. I could not let that be the story you had. Thomas felt his palms go damp. The decades of habit that had taught him to keep his life in tidy, numbered rows rebelled at the mess of human choices. There was a reckoning in front of him, and it asked for a kind of courage he had not practiced. He had several choices: fold the photograph and put it back into its small world, demand retribution from men who thought objects were their currency, walk away and keep the grief as a sanctified thing, or step forward into the dim hope of reconciliation with a woman who had chosen exile for love or for fear. He reached for her hand more by want than by plan. When their fingers touched, it was not the merging of two complete things, but the meeting of halves that had been trying to find their brace. Her skin was warmer than he had imagined, and the scent of jasmine rose like an old answer. For a whirling instant, the ledger of Thomas's life settled into a single arithmetic, the sum of what remained and what might yet be. He felt the world tilt toward a possibility that had been kept at the margins of his life. Then a sound split the contracted air. Not thunder, but the measured tread of other feet, the kind that come with habit and with professional intent. The embankment, which had kept its secrets and the city's discarded things, opened a new entry in its ledger of events. Thomas turned and saw, between the stacks of found and hidden objects, figures emerging the way tides part for something they have long been expecting to meet. Judge stepped forward first, his coat a dark ledger at the center of the tableau, his expression like a man who keeps accounts in which little is ever forgiven. Behind him moved two others. One the man Thomas had recognized in the camera feed, the fox silhouette who recoiled at the cat's insistence. The other a new face, a shadow's apprentice. They were not yet violent, but their presence felt like the arrival of a clause in a contract that had been unsigned. Thomas Alder, Judge said, as if the name were a term of business. The way he said it suggested he had written it in his own books. You're meddling in affairs that don't belong to you. Thomas, whose hands had lent themselves to the small boldness of picking up a photograph, felt as if a wind had been taken from his sails. He did not answer with threats or anger. Instead, he let the humility of the wronged speak in him. "These are mine," he said, and his voice, small as it was, carried the weight of a man who had learned that to own nothing was to be bereft of everything. "These belong to my life." Judge smiled, and it was a smile designed to balance accounts. "Belonged is a brittle word, Mr. Alder. Things circulate. People trade what is inconvenient. You collect and think it righteousness. But there are costs." Evelyn's hand tightened on his. Her presence, firm, unexpected, necessary, became an argument in itself. She did not speak in the way of counsel, but of a person who had kept herself in readiness for the moment when a ledger might be contested. "You took what people hid to keep them safe," she said, and her voice held the kind of anger that comes from lives endangered by cynical arithmetic. "You sold memories that were supposed to be refuges. You called it commerce. You called it survival." Judge's smile hardened into a calculating thing. "We live by exchange, woman. A city runs on transaction. You hid, then fled, then left a mess for men like me to tidy. Mr. Alder, the law of the market is the law of survival." Thomas felt the blood in his face rise like tide. He had come to this place with the thought he could reclaim what had been made his by life and marriage and memory. Now he saw how wrong that thought might be, when the market of human need treats memory as a commodity. He realized the cat's returns had not merely been gifts, but the header of a negotiation. Objects returned meant obligations restored. In the corner of his eye, the fox silhouette shifted, a predator of opportunity smelling fault lines. The embankment, with its piles of used things, had become a ledger in which men like Judge wrote margins in their favor. "You sold our things?" Thomas asked, and his voice did not carry the heat of accusation alone, but the pained astonishment of a man learning that the world had been permitted to monetize the sacredness of his past. "Hoarded or hid, both are the same to men like me," Judge said. "When I buy, I either sell to someone who has a use or keep it hidden if no one will pay. Your wife's hiding places were as cheap as any. We trade, Mr. Alder. We keep order." In the pause that followed those words, the cat stood, a small principled thing, and leapt. It landed with a quiet command against Judge's boot, as if to remind him that the night had its own tribunal. The man's foot came up with a snap, reflex sharpened by a lifetime of quick deals. His hand went to a pocket and then withdrew empty. He had expected the small violence meant to keep a market in order, but the animal's modest defiance unaccountably unsettled him. It was not for him to face a cat and lose his cool. It was for him to keep accounts. Evelyn stepped forward, and whatever fear had been in her years of exile resketched into an odd courage that looked like forgiveness, wrapped in indignation. She addressed Judge with a voice that slid between softness and steel. "Give back what belongs," she demanded. "These are not items to be balanced in your books. They are pieces of people's lives." Judge laughed, and his laugh had the small cruelty of someone who believes laws can be bent to circumstance. "And who will make me? You woman hiding like a ghost? Come then." His hand, quicker than most, flicked. A blade showed. Not long, but enough to say business could be made to speak in terms men understand. The underpass constricted into a place of clear clauses. Demand, refusal, possible violence. Thomas felt the decision press against him like the weight of water against a dam. Every muscle in him poised between the ledger's arithmetic and the real mathematics of heart. He could step away and leave words to men with knives. He could let Evelyn handle it as someone who had already lived through the hard exchanges. Or he could stand and make a small human refusal to barter memory to the lowest bidder. The choice would mark the line between a life kept neat and a life risked in the hope of reclaiming its own names. He spoke then, voice thin at first, and then gaining a certainty that surprised him. "Take nothing more," he said, and the statement was not made with the bluster of bravado but with the quiet moral courage of a person who refuses to allow his past to be traded. What belongs to people belongs to them, not to the market. Judge stepped closer, and the cold glint of the blade justified a new fear. "You make enemies of men who count," he said. "That is not a comfortable place, Mr. Alder." Before any answer could shape itself on Thomas's face, before there could be the civilized violence of contracts made by harsh hands, a sound like a single gunshot tore the air with a sharpness that all the city recognized and feared. The sound was not a promise but an alarm. It split the rain into 1,000 startled pieces and made the embankment's loose objects clap like surprised hands. Time contracted to a single seam. Marcus ducked, and a paper of cardboard flew up as if startled into flight. Mrs. Patel let out a small, surprised shriek and took cover behind a broken door. Evelyn's body moved in one instinctive arc as she dropped, tiny and quick, to shield Thomas, as if the old roles of care and shared hazard had been reassigned by accident of blood and habit. The cat, with a composure that would shame a dozen policemen, flattened itself into the shadow between the stacks and watched with lantern eyes. There, in that charged, suspended second, Thomas felt every possibility crack open and release a new calculus. Survival measured in flinch and breath. Truth measured against the price of a bullet. He understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with ledger columns and everything to do with the raw bone of being, that the discovery of Evelyn, a gratitude and a wound all at once, had moved them into a space that men who make their living in margins would not forgive lightly. He had come to reconcile, to gather, to read the handwriting of his life in recovered objects. Now he was asked immediately and with cold efficiency to pay with skin and breath. The city's economy had never favored tenderness. The cat that had been a small priestess at his porch now crouched like a quiet sentinel as the flood of consequences closed in. As the second passed, as Evelyn lay protectively and the men moved with the patient brutality of people who trade in fear, Thomas made the hardest decision of all: to stand in the place of a man who had learned to count and to risk the imbalanced arithmetic of the heart. He rose at once, the photograph clutched in his fist like a small proof that he was not merely a man of loss, and moved as if toward the person who had fired the shot. He did not know whether he would ask for explanation, revenge, or the return of a life that had been broken into dealable pieces. He only knew that staying inert was to allow numbers to rule. His foot had taken one step when other steps came from the dark, faster and more disciplined than the chaos of small thieves. Flashlights cut the rain into lines. Voices barked the language of law, with the certainty of people who believe in blue uniforms and hard paperwork. For an instant the scene turned theatrical. Judge's men cursed. A figure in a dark coat fell back as a hand reached for cuffs. Someone yelled for hands up. And in the brief collision of intent and action, the world found an odd balance. Police, rival enforcers? The distinction blurred in the wet light. A hand landed hard on Thomas's shoulder and held him fast. He looked up, and the grip belonged to a person who was neither Judge nor Evelyn, nor Marcus nor spectator. The man's eyes were shadowed, his mouth hard with the knowledge of deeds transacted in corners. He leaned close, and his voice was a rasp of agreement and warning. "Put the photograph down," he said quietly. "You don't know what you're holding." At that moment Thomas realized, with a clarity that came like the sudden flipping of a page, that every act of retrieval had been a pull on a line tied to other hands, and those hands had never been neutral. He had imagined himself detective and husband and righteous man. He had not accounted for the machinery of the city that keeps memory as one keeps currency. The photograph in his hand felt suddenly like a detonator. The scene contracted. The rain grew loud enough to be the only honest witness. Judge shuffled legal threats. The fox silhouette moved like one scouting for a bargain. Evelyn lifted her head and looked at Thomas with the kind of look that asks for decisions to be made from courage, and not from ledger. Marcus peered out between broken timbers, and in his boy's face was the astonishment of apprenticeship, the moment when a child watches the adult world reveal its hard logic. And then came another sound, closer, from the direction of the embankment where the first shot had come. It was a shout, a name called sharp and urgent. The light of a car's headlights carved a path across the underpass like a new day, insisting it had not yet given up. Figures poured in, some with the language of uniforms and some with the lined faces of men who keep shops and make swift judgments. The air filled with commands, questions, the noise of lives that had been interrupted and now demanded their due. Between the barking orders and the sudden official presence, Thomas felt an odd and awful stillness. His choice had moved the world into motion, and the next beat would decide the geometry of consequence. He had stood to claim what was his and to speak against the market where memories are sold. He had confronted a man who called himself judge. He had found Evelyn alive and courageous. He had made himself present in a place meant to be avoided. Now the stakes were no longer only his ledger. They were the safety of a woman who had fled to protect him, the integrity of small tokens that had once functioned as anchors, and the life of a cat that had become an unintentional courier of meaning. As voices rose and feet stuttered like a strange percussion, Thomas felt the photograph slip from his fingers. It fluttered briefly, like a trapped bird, and then the world narrowed to a single terrible hush. Something, mischance. Design a hand too quick took the photograph, and for a breath none of them moved, as if the photograph had become the keystone in an arch that could either stand or collapse. A gloved hand closed around the paper. Thomas lunged. The movement that followed was not cinematic. It was intimate and messy and full of human consequence. Hands grabbed wrists. A voice shouted a name. The cat leapt between ankles and then froze, its body a living punctuation. And in that breath, before any resolution, before any piece of ledger or law had time to write itself into the pages of the night, the world let out a small, hard sound like the closing of a book. Would you stay if you were in their place? For a long instant after the photograph vanished into the gloved hand, the world held its breath as if a giant page had been turned and everyone were waiting to see what the next line would say. Then sound returned, the bark of orders, the rattle of feet, the small human noises that come when people decide to act rather than only to witness. Thomas felt his knees unsteady beneath him, as if the simple physics of standing required a balance he had not yet relearned. Evelyn, quick and practiced though she had been scarred by exile, sat up and bared the thin, hard face of someone who had lived by movement rather than ledger. Marcus, a boy still learning the trade of courage, had vanished into the dark and returned with breathless news. A policeman was on his way, he said, and had been sent by a man at the cross street who kept an ear for wrongness. Mrs. Patel, whose voice had always been a broom for small neighborhood tangles, had become something else, an alarm pulled by habit, shouting for lights to be switched on, for people to come look and see the ugliness the embankment tried to hide. Judge's men moved with the practice of people who thought the night belonged to them. Their hands were quick and their faces were economy. They believed in transactions more than in mercy. One reached for the blade again when he thought the photograph might be traded for silence. Before the hand closed, however, the cat, quiet, impossible, the odd emissary of the street, sprang with a speed that denied its size. It brushed the man's wrist and sent the blade clattering into a puddle, where rain made of the city's worst secrets silvered the steel. The man swore like a creditor and lunged. In the flurry that followed, there were the commonplace small violences of men who do not reckon with the cost of what they take. A shove, a scuffing fall, the scrape of a boot against brick. And then, as if a curtain had been ripped and actors from the other side finally stepped on stage, footsteps came in a different rhythm. Flashlights cut the rain into lines. A tall figure in a uniform pushed through the dark with the kind of purpose a badge gives. "Police!" the voice called, and the single syllable carried the authority of law and the hope of protection both. Those who had been searching for bargain and advantage saw a new balance of force and hesitated. Judge, who had the sort of composure bought by long practice at making the world small, stepped back and tried to smooth his expression into one that said he belonged to commerce rather than to crime. His men, less quick with the art of reinvention, found themselves being counted and cuffed as if invisible columns had been laid across their trades. The scene unspooled in human time. Questions asked, hands raised, statements given with the quick, pained honesty of people who had been startled into truth. Marcus explained what he had seen and where, his words tripping and falling into exactness like stones thrown into a pond. "There's boxes under the tarpaulin, stuff hidden," he told the constable, and then with the bluntness of one who finds it hard to be cautious with good news, the cat brought things back to his porch. It kept coming back. The policeman, Officer Rahman, who had nodded once at Marcus and then moved like a man who would not be dissuaded, began to look at the night with the patience of someone who reads wrongs as if they were receipts. Judge muttered about misunderstandings in trade. He offered names in exchange for silence, the old currency of people who assume they can buy what they have already stolen. The officer, who had seen too many such bargains weaken the law, listened with an evenness that was not pity, but the steadiness of someone whose job it is to turn rumor into record. He took statements from Evelyn, who spoke with the economy of a person who had long practiced speaking only when forced. She said plainly and without melodrama that she had hidden things to keep them from being made into other people's merchandise, that she had feared men who kept ledgers for crimes and called themselves merely businessmen. It was an explanation that carried neither plea nor pride, only the tired clarity of worth kept from the grasping. The evidence began to line up like bricks. Thomas's porch camera footage, grainy, faithful, and immune to human argument, had recorded Judge's men in the embankment often enough to show patterns. Officer Rahman made a careful, slow file of the recordings, his fingers moving with the deliberate competence of a man who has learned that proof is the kindest companion to justice. The crate under the tarpaulin was opened fully now, and its oilcloth bundles were unfolded and sorted. Inside were enough tokens to make a life's catalog. Letters, a child's small shoe, a watch, knickknacks of the sort memory loves. Some were tarnished by river water. Some were intact, enough in the officer's estimation to warrant a proper investigation and the sort of scrutiny that makes deals less comfortable to those who prefer the dark. Judge, whose arrogance had been a thin veneer over worry, tried to bargain. He promised to return things if the matter was left unpursued. He offered phrases like misunderstanding and old debt. The officer, learning how the world counts, replied with the law's more patient instruments. Arrests to be made, paperwork to be filed, places to search. Judge's face hardened. He had been an operator who liked margins. Being brought to the light felt like a tax on his pride. He signaled to his men, who cuffed and cuffed again, realized the market of night had turned, and the cost of their work might now be paid in a cell rather than in coin. The small, unbending logic of justice and of community carried them further than any sudden heroics. Neighbors, roused by Mrs. Patel's shrill summons, had arrived with lanterns and hands and eyes that saw the embankment differently now, not as a place for discards, but as a place that had been made grieving by other people's commerce. The crowd's presence turned memory into witness. Where once a few men might have made bargains beneath the tarpaulin, now a collection of witnesses, ordinary people with ordinary small courage, stood in the rain and recounted days when they had seen boxes moved, when they had heard Judge's men talk of buyers. Their testimony would warm the cold machinery of law into something like protection. The cat, always watching, walked the perimeter of the scene with calm dignity, as if satisfied that the balance had been tipped back a degree toward rightness. It leapt onto the lip of the crate and, with the mechanical modesty of an animal that has performed what it seems to have been made to do, pawed at a bundle and then sat with the stillness of something that knew it had finished one task, and that there might be more to come. Thomas felt the muscles of tiredness give way in his shoulders as if someone had removed a small but constant weight. The adrenaline ebbed and was replaced by a tenderness that reached into him like rain into soil. Once the immediate danger had been contained, Officer Rahman took Thomas and Evelyn aside with the kind of procedural care the law affords to those who are both witness and victim. Paperwork was filled, statements were sworn, names were given. Evelyn, in the neat way of someone who has carried the burden of secrecy for too long, produced more details. Small places where she had hidden things, names of people to whom she had once paid to keep the caches quiet, and the reasons, tender and blunt, why she had fled. Her honesty shone not as confession but as a ledger entry made right. She had chosen exile to protect a man she thought deserved better than to be dragged into debt's public square. The policeman listened and nodded. Some parts of truth are best kept simple. Judge was taken in hand not by anger alone but by a process that would now demand the cost of accounting. The cogs of local justice wound slowly but undeniably. Things were logged. Those arrested would be held to examine who bought and who sold, and the crates would be inventoried for rightful owners. Evelyn's information supplied a map to cupboards and lockers where other hidden goods were kept. The officer's patience paid like steady interest. For the first time in a good many years, it seemed that the misplacement of memory might be put back into orderly hands. Hands that did not move like predators but like keepers. As the immediate legalities were attended to, the community's softer work began at the porch. Neighbors came with towels to warm damp fingers and with hot tea in paper cups that steamed in the rain. Mrs. Patel fussed as she always did, and, under her brusque manner, the edges of relief showed themselves like a small sun-through cloud. Marcus, shaking with the residuals of fear and triumph, spoke in halting ways about what he had seen and who had been brave. "I thought it might be a ghost," he admitted with the honesty of youth when he thought no one would judge that fear. The neighbors laughed and turned the fear into heat, and in the laughter the night lost some of its sharpness. The photograph, rescued but now slightly creased and wet at the corners, was returned to Thomas. He unfolded it with a small, reverential motion, and saw in it not only a record but a compass, an emblem of seasons they had lived through. The locket, dusty and bright where rain had polished its edges, was opened and its small portrait upright again as if to assert its life. Thomas ran his thumb over the metal and felt the warm roughness of living things not yet made into memory proper. The objects were returned not as trophies but as relics to be handled with the care of those who understand that things are made of people's days and debts, not of mere coin. Once the legal mechanism had been set in motion, there was a long practical labor to undertake. Officer Rahman, efficient and decent, arranged for the stolen goods to be catalogued and for rightful claimants to be sought. Judge's men were booked and processed. Evelyn, who had for years lived under the cost of choices, spoke plainly to the officers and agreed to help them untangle the web of caches she had known. Her cooperation, it turned out, would save time and help return items to their owners more quickly than the law alone could manage. The neighborhood volunteered to help with that work, because woven into the fabric of small communities is a particular care that means people will put their hands to mending things when they can. In the days that followed, the cat continued to come to the porch. It brought nothing dramatic, no more crates, and yet it brought back a kind of presence that steadied the household. The lavender, which had been disturbed so often in the cat's rituals, flourished anew as neighbors cleared away debris and replaced soil. The small sprout that had pushed through the pot months earlier grew greener, as hands that had been absent cultivated it with a new purpose. The jasmine, rubbed and knotted where memory had once leaned against railings, burst into bloom like a chorus answering an old tune. The plants, which had been the first soft signs of change, were now proof that attention can coax life out of the most stubborn places. Thomas, who had once tended them like a man who does not expect miracles, now labored among them with an affection that was both private and public. There were other, less botanical payoffs. The neighbors who had once treated the embankment as a place of passing glanced now with new eyes. A woman who had been thought by many to be merely ornamental, Mrs. Patel, organized a schedule for porch light keeping. People took turns ensuring that the porch light, no longer only a vigil for Thomas's habit but a small community beacon, burned through the night. That tiny light, which had once only said "someone remembers," now served as a public sign. "This corner keeps watch for what the world discards." Thomas himself walked a road he had not imagined when the photograph first blinked on his camera feed. He had started the campaign as a man who sought to reclaim tokens. He found himself in the work of reconciling living things with their pasts. He went to police interviews and to kitchens where neighbors, old and new, sat and told stories of lost items and of how small things can become anchors. He learned to speak of Evelyn in ways that were not staccato and ledgered, but gentle and specific. He named the stain on the locket, and the way her laughter had, in memory, always come late. He began to let the pages of his ledger be written with words of human hazard, rather than with just columns of loss and gain. Evelyn, whose exile had been an act of protection and of exile's fatigue, found in the legal work a new kind of work that required both sadness and courage. She accompanied officers to lockers and basements, identifying objects with a rough, touching accuracy. She spoke at a neighborhood meeting, the sort where strong women sit at the kitchen table and resolve complex issues with the simplicity of shared bread, and told the story, not to be absolved but to explain how she had tried to save them all by keeping things hidden. The community listened, and in its listening, forgave something that had needed forgiveness. Not only the hiding, but the human fear beneath it. She did not ask for absolution. She asked only to be allowed to help put the world back together. The men who had been arrested by Officer Rahman fared as men do. Some were held for prosecutable actions. Some were given the arc of a court where the market is told it must meet law. Judge, who had always thought himself a ledger's shrewdest hand, found the pattern of his life challenged. He faced inquiry not only about traded goods, but about whether his supposed commerce had veered into trafficking in other people's griefs. The consequences would not be quick, nor would they be theatrical. The engine of justice is slow. It is a loom that rewrites a cloth by small, steady reknitting, but the first threads were pulled taut and the fabric began to mend, and somewhere along in the steadying, the cat performed a small final ministry that meant more than any headline. It walked in the cool after rain to the lavender pot and set down a thing, a frayed ribbon not unlike the one Thomas had kept in the drawer for months. The blue of it faded but true. It did not throw it like a challenge nor present it like a trophy. It set it down with the kind of deliberation that equates to a benediction. The ribbon, a thing of soft cloth and no mistaken value, lay in the saucer as if to say that some ties are not transactional and that a small, ordinary thing can be an answer to the heart's need for a sign. Thomas picked it up with fingers that had learned new tenderness. The ribbon smelled faintly of the jasmine that had returned to the porch. He held it against his chest and found in the act of touching ordinary fabric a reconciliation of sorts. He felt less like a man who kept a ledger, and more like a man who had re-entered life's accounts with pen and kindness. He had been offered by the city's odd courier, a simple proof that the world could return gifts when it had been asked to do so by people who watched and worked. He set it into his drawer, not as a talisman but as an acknowledged truth. Some things are given back, not to cancel owing but to mend what has unraveled. In the evenings that followed, the porch light kept its watch and Thomas kept his. He and Evelyn sat together for the first time in years with no grand gestures but with coffee and the soft ceremonial of plates passed and jokes, small and stupid, and the sort of silence that does not mean absence but comfort. Marcus brought stories from the grocer about new people in the neighborhood and about how he now saw the embankment with different eyes. Mrs. Patel kept the list of porches and those who would check them. The cat, who in the beginning had been a figure moving between need and action, became a presence at the edge of their household life, sometimes inside, sometimes not, but always within reach like something whose loyalty was earned rather than bought. There were wounds that would take longer to stitch, legal proceedings that would require testimonies, the awkwardness of neighbors who had once pretended not to see, and the quiet days when Thomas would remember the ledger of grief and wonder if all had been reconciled. Yet even in those quieter reckonings, the work of the embankment's night had made a difference. Things were now accounted for. People who trafficked in the private were named and dealt with, and a small community had learned to be a net rather than a gutter. And in the place where plants had first offered a hint of transformation, life returned more insistently. The sprout from the lavender pot became a stem. The jasmine climbed the rail like praise. Even the cracked geranium found room to unfurl its petals. Those plants had been the first modest witness to change, and in their flourishing Thomas read a moral that felt like a sentence Rudyard Kipling might have appreciated. That small attentions are great resistances against a world that would commodify everything. The city could be cruel, but it was also a place where a porch light and the steady work of neighbors could make the night less absolute. At the end of the week, in a small, unceremonious gathering, the neighborhood marked what had happened not with a triumph but with a quiet meal on paper plates and the kind of laughter that is half relief and half the rehearsal of hope. People exchanged recipes and told stories of lost things found. Evelyn told without shame of why she had left and why she had come back. A story of fear and love that needed no corona of drama. Thomas, softer now in the edges where he had once been hard, listened and sometimes supplied the small fact that he had missed her laugh. Marcus, who had grown a measure that could not be priced, received a nod from men who had once thought him a kid with a stocking for courage. The cat slept at the foot of the porch as if to judge how well human affairs were being handled. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? The question appeared among the neighbors as a kind of quietly placed inquiry, not an accusation but a soft invitation to remember. People answered with small, tender confessions. The dog that waited for a boy to return, the pigeon that came every morning to a window, the goat that visited a yard and stayed. These were not grand gestures of cosmic meaning, but the simple miracles of allegiance. The cat, without word or reason, had made such miracles happen by being present where the world had been careless. By degrees, the central conflict that had brought them damp and breathless to the embankment eased into the steady hum of consequence and repair. Judge faced inquiry and was made to sit before questions he could not buy his way out of. His men, who had trafficked in memory, learned the cost of making lives into trade. Evelyn's cooperation shortened the distance between conviction and clarity. The stolen things, catalogued and returned where possible, became threads stitched back into blankets rather than commodities exchanged on a street. Thomas had changed, immeasurably, but quietly. He took to walking the porch at dusk and greeting the plants by name in the way some men talk to their books. He learned to answer when asked how he was, not with the ledger's precise phrase, but with truths that included not only how much he missed, but how much he had been given. The porch light that once had been merely his vigil became a lamp for others. People came and sat on the steps on bad nights and spoke about small things that, when shared, became less sharp. The cat, whose business had always been its own and whose purpose the city would never fully understand, came, as habit, to rest on the mat. It did not stay forever, for some creatures prefer the road, but it stayed long enough to be fed and stroked and given a name by someone who had once kept names in drawers. Hallow, someone whispered one evening, and the name, soft as a bell, settled into use among those who loved simple words. It accepted the affection as if it had been a currency worth something more than coin. When the work of law and neighborliness settled into the more ordinary order of days, the final small payoffs returned in the ordinary rhythms of care. The locket hung dusted and polished back at the place where it once had been hidden. The photograph, slightly creased but more love-worn than lost, found a frame. The blue ribbon was tucked where small things are kept, not on display but in a drawer whose contents matters to whomever opens it. The plants flourishing testified in green and scent that attention ripens into life. The falling action is a place where consequences collect and where the world inches back toward rest. They had paid a price, time, fear, a brief reawakening of old wounds, but they had also received a greater education in what it means to keep vigil for one another. Thomas, whose hands had once written only accounts of absence, now wrote letters again, short notes to a woman who had been gone and returned, to Marcus, to Mrs. Patel. He wrote not because he had to record them, but because the act of recording was a way to keep memory from being traded. He learned the hard way that the heart's ledger is not the same as the pocket's. The embankment, which had been a place where things drifted away, became by slow degrees a place of return. Judge's pattern of quiet profiteering was interrupted enough to make the city less hospitable to that kind of trade. The neighbors who had once passed each other with polite distance now shared porches and concerns. A porch light kept with care had altered the margins of their lives. In that soft unthreading, the moral gently arranged itself. The city may propose markets where hearts are exchangeable and memories can be bartered. But small resistances, lamps left burning, hands reached out, cats that choose to return the gifts of the world, rewrite the terms of that economy. Thomas had begun as a man who kept his life in rows. He had ended this portion of the tale as a man who kept the people in his life before the things that might be used to remember them. The ledger did not vanish. It found new columns. When night settled and the porch light hummed its thin hymn, Thomas would sit with Evelyn and listen to the cat's breathing and the distant city. The plants would answer the dark with the green certainty of growth. The work that had been done would not free them from future trials, but it had taught them that the small tasks, cleaning the lavender pot, checking the camera feed, replacing bulbs, sharing tea, are the kind of courage that erects better defenses than armor. They were not heroic in a way that novels often insist upon. They were human, and in the ordinary their courage was luminous. There remained one last, private act before the chapter truly closed. Thomas, in the hush of a morning that smelled of rain and fresh soil, walked to the lavender pot and pressed the blue ribbon into the soft earth as if planting a sentence. He did not bury the past so much as shelter it with the promise of return. The ribbon rested against the roots like a quiet agreement. That memory once returned will be tended. The cat, Hallow, circled him, then settled. And for a moment the man and the animal and the plants formed a small tribunal of peace. They had come through a difficult night and had learned that the making right of things requires both law and tenderness. In the aftermath, when the city kept its peculiar pace and the embankment resumed its ordinary rhythm of work and waste, those who had been touched by the small miracle of reclaimed memory found themselves quieter but not less alive. They carried the lesson back into their days, that things become sacred when they are returned with care, and that a porch light is not only an electric bulb, but a covenant to look after one another. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? When the dust of that night settled into the kind of quiet that is not sleep, but the sober work of recovery, the small town learned how to keep a story without breaking it. The public business, files filed, questions asked, judges men having to account for transactions that had disguised themselves as commerce, took the time the law takes to breathe. Yet most of the work that mattered happened in soft places. On the porch steps over cups of tea that steamed like small reconciliations, in the patching of broken things, in the naming of the hours in which people would stand watch, Thomas found himself in the slow arithmetic of day, traded from being a man who counted absence into a man who kept accounts of presence. Evelyn moved with a careful lightness that had been earned in the dark. She did not come back with trumpet-blown apologies or with the heavy ornaments of a wrong undone. She came back with a few boxes, the sort of things people take when they mean to make a place again. She took up the small work of returning items that had been mislaid in the market of the night. A letter to the woman who had once taught at the school. A watch to a man whose teeth were now gone but whose memory of time remained. A child's shoe to a family that thought it had been lost forever. She accepted the awkwardness of being forgiven by people who had the right to be guarded, and she offered in exchange the plain currency of repair, hands that would help where hands were needed, words that would not ask to be loved but would gladly be listened to. Thomas learned to speak the name of grief with a different accent. Where before his grief had been a ledger, neat entries, a balance never closed, now it took the shape of a garden. He went into the work of tending not to undo what had been but to honor it. He planted another lavender sprig and watched it take. He loosened soil in the pot where the blue ribbon rested like a small stone tucked into moss, and he began to write letters again. Short notes that did not attempt to account for absence but attempted instead to honor what remained. These were not grand gestures but the honest, slow acts that keep people near. A plate warmed, a door left unlocked at the small hour for a neighbor who tends to wander, a pot replaced on a porch as if to say, "We will keep watch together." The community's rituals rearranged themselves around the porch light. Where the lamp had once been Thomas's solitary promise, it became, almost without ceremony, a signal board of the neighborhood's care. People took turns. Someone always made sure it burned. It did more than illuminate steps and faces. It made a small geography of safety that ran like a lit seam through the local nights. Stories were told, retold, and softened into habits that meant when the world came at them hard, they would have already practiced the gentleness of being there. The embankment, which had been a geography of absences, became a place of reckonings. Boxes were opened, their contents inventoried and given back. Some owners were found easily, others had changed addresses, lives having the strange business of moving people away from their old pins on the map. There were consolations discovered that cannot be weighed. The knowledge that a memory, if not exactly the same as before, had been made to travel back into a hand that remembered its meaning. For some, the recovery did not heal the hollowness, but it stitched a thread where before was a tear. The law's slow hand would continue to wrestle with those who trafficked in other people's memories, and it would, in its deliberate way, put questions to men who had thought themselves shrewd. In the end, markets which rely on the currency of private things crack when communities learn the price of what matters. Judge, whose name had once been a small laugh and a gesture of dismissal in the grocers' lanes, was discomfited by a process he could neither quicken nor control. He found that transactions made under the dark do not stand well in the light. The men who had been his instruments were asked to explain where they had procured the goods, why they had sold them, and to whom. Some of the answers made a mess of the tidy stories they liked to tell about commerce. Some of the answers, when written down, read like indictments. There is always a slow justice that arrives when enough people agree your balances are wrong. For Judge, the consequences were not simple. They were, like all real consequences, a mixture of practical accounting and the more delicate public shaming of being found where one should not have been. Evelyn's return was the story's most tender reconciliation. It did not come wrapped in sermon. Instead, it arrived as a series of small recognitions. She put Thomas's chair back in its old place so his knees did not ache when he sat. She learned to move in the kitchen with the same rhythm he remembered, and sometimes she made tea the way she always had, slices of something small and sensible and delicious tucked beneath its steam. She did not explain every absence nor ask for every forgiveness at once. Instead, she accepted the slow work of being lived with again. The ledger between them bent toward being a book of shared days rather than a record of what each had lost. Thomas found new work in being surprised. There is a curious tenderness a man learns when he realizes his life can still produce small wonders. The sudden laugh from a memory that had lain quiet. A plate set with the wrong fork as if someone had been thinking about him. The cat's improbable arrival with another small token. Usually not a relic that once belonged to him, but something the animal had found that fit the mood of the morning. Each small, unexpected thing taught him how little one knows of the world's charity when both hands are open to receive. It Hallow, the name that had come like a small bell from a neighbor one evening and then settled, continued to move through the neighborhood as all wise things do. Part domestic guest, part vagrant sage. It accepted milk in a soft place on the mat, but it always kept the road in its bones. It visited other porches, other pots of lavender, other people's sleep. It never stayed long enough to be domesticated in the neat sense, and yet it had anchored itself in the hearts of those who watched the embankment's strange commerce and decided to do something about it. The animal had become a living witness to what small attentions could achieve. There were payoffs to the plants that had been planted not only in soil, but in habit. The lavender grew, its scent catering to evening conversation like a wise hostess. The jasmine climbed another inch each month, and in its leaves held the memory of hands that had once leaned against the banister. The geranium found space to shout its bright counterpoint to the gray of the house's oldness. Each new leaf seemed to say that life, if given a light and a neighborly hand, will return even from a place of near abandonment. The plants were not mere ornament, they were proofs, and in their green the neighborhood read a fable about how watching and small acts of care can change a corner of the world. Thomas and Evelyn learned the art of ordinary apologies. In a small house where objects are the language of long days, forgiveness is often practiced by the movement of things rather than by high-sounding words. A photograph placed where it can be seen, a ribbon tucked into a drawer rather than left in the dark, a letter written and then read aloud over tea. They built a new ritual. Once a week, they would spend a little time sitting on the porch looking at the light and naming quietly the things they were grateful for. Small gratitude, not grand epiphany. It was, in its way, a civility, a way of rechalking a boundary that had been worn by grief and by time. There were other, quieter consequences, less public and no less real. Marcus, the grocer's boy whose courage had become the spark that brought Officer Ramon's attention, found a path forward. The neighborhood, who had once seen him as another child with too many watchful nights, now respected him with the sort of regard that asks nothing but gives encouragement. He took a job helping with the community's small watch schedule and learned the modest dignity of work that keeps others safe. Mrs. Patel, whose directness had so often been misread as merely sharp, became the keeper of lists and schedules, and people came to her with keys and concerns because she had become, in her way, the town's small mayor of the porch. The fragile fabric of trust that had frayed was stitched again, not by fiat nor by decree, but by the steady application of daily gestures. People came to know each other's small needs and learned how to meet them. They learned that watching a porch light is as much an act of public kindness as policing the embankment was an act of civic duty. The law had done its work. The neighborhood had done its own. Together, the two forces proved enough to make a market less hospitable to those who traffic in memory. The cat, whose work had been both mysterious and practical, offered one last gift that did not carry the weight of evidence but the lightness of closure. One evening, at the moment when dusk softens into the exact color of memory, the animal walked onto the porch and lay down against Thomas's feet. It did not press the blue ribbon into his hand, nor did it return a locket or a photograph. Instead, it gave him something perhaps more difficult to regain: patience. Hallow's presence was the kind that teaches a man to sit and to listen, to let the world reveal itself slowly and without demand. The cat's final ministry was small and domestic, a partner in quietness. What remained unrectified was not absence but pain. Some things could not be restored to their original shape. A stolen day could not be unspent. A lost hour could not be found. But they could be honored in the ways people keep their promises: by planting lavender and remembering its fragrance, by leaving a light burning on a chilly night, by returning a photograph to its frame. There is a certain human dignity in allowing grief to be worked upon rather than stored away. Thomas found in the slow art of mending that a life can be repaired not because the world is perfectly just, but because people choose, together, to keep things that matter. In the end, the moral that grew from the porches and the embankment was of the sort Kipling might have set into a small parable: that the world is set with markets and men who will count everything as income or loss, but that there is another economy, less calculable, more humane, where attention, care, and small acts of courage are the tenderest currency. The cat had been a guide not because it taught commandments, but because its visits insisted that someone cared enough to return what should not have been taken. The plants and the lamp had been the first modest witness. The people of that lane had been the final instrument. When Thomas took the photograph down from its place at last, he held it carefully. It had creases the rain had made and a softness the years had given it. He placed it on the mantel, and instead of letting it be an altar to absence, he let it be an instruction that things are better alive in the world when they are known and kept by a community. He promised himself, not in ledgered terms but in the small and stubborn language of habit, to keep the light for as long as he could. He promised, more importantly, to go to the embankment sometimes, not as a man looking for bargains, but as a man offering company. The days flowed then with a new pattern: morning tea and a check on the feed, a walk to the embankment with hands in pockets, a visit to the grocer where Marcus told tall, true stories, evening on the porch with a new place set for Evelyn. The city would not change its nature. There would be nights when men tried to profit from other people's privacies, but the neighborhood had learned to be vigilant. Such vigilance is not heroic in the headline sense. It is the quiet, persistent kind that keeps human economies humane. If there is a summation to this small and gentle affair, it is that redemption in a life is often less a single dramatic act than a sequence of small returns. The blue ribbon, planted in the lavender pot as if to bind memory to the slow work of growth, became a marker of that truth. It was not a monument. It was a promise. That things will be tended and not trafficked. That names will be spoken and not sold. That a porch light can do more than make a path. It can keep one. And so the final scene, which is not a scene but a settling, leaves Thomas and Evelyn at the table where they once ate in silence and now eat with conversation. It leaves Marcus with a job and Mrs. Patel with a list and a smile that is less sharp and more warm. It leaves Judge to his reckonings and the law to its slow writing motions. It leaves the embankment less full of shadow and more watched. It leaves Hallow, the cat, likely off to find other small commissions the city may need, but returning at times to be fed and stroked and to remind the people on that little lane that tenderness is a policy as effective as any law when it is practiced. Most of all, it leaves a community that learned the trade of looking after what belongs to people, and it leaves a man who learned to keep his grief with hands that do useful things. A strong ending is not always the fireworks of great novels. Sometimes it is a small flame that will not go out. In this house, the flame was a bulb above a porch and the careful, mutual tending of things that keep human life whole. The lamp hummed on nights and the lavender smelled of the habit of care. The photograph on the mantel, the locket cleaned and returned, The blue ribbon not a relic but a keepsake. These were the stitches. They did not make the past vanish, but they made living with it possible and even gentle. That was the finalness of the affair. Not that everything was healed, no human book closes so neatly, but that people had learned to stand together when the night tempted them to trade their memories for coin. You stayed with me till the very end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft purr in your heart, subscribing helps me share more stories like this.